Good evening, Rabbi. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Sunday Night Live. Rabbi Eisenberg, how was Purim?
Quiet, really nice and quiet. I actually enjoy the quiet. I don't know about you. You're not living in the Cholon Pond anymore, but one of the things I definitely did not miss is the floats.
Yes, yeah, used to get those. Used to be a regular and very loud and disruptive feature. But this year, sadly not. Right, Rabbi, before we get into our topic this week, obviously I'm mindful that there is another campaign doing the rounds this weekend for the CST. So we're going to highlight that. I'm going to play the CST's campaign video, a link to donate to the Shrubs page that goes direct to the CST is there as well. Very worthy cause. I'm going to pop this on now for everybody to see.
Cable Street, 1936. London's East End Jews fought back against the fascists. 3 years later, Britain fought the Nazis. But when the war ended, Jewish servicemen and women returned home and were appalled to see fascists once more. These Jews formed street-fighting groups and continued the tradition of standing up against racism, against anti-Semitism, which shockingly continued even in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The lessons had been learned. These activists knew they had to take matters into their own hands, to protect their families, their communities, and these were the roots of CST, Community Security Trust, where hundreds of Jewish men and women, young and old from every corner of the community, stand up to protect Jewish life in the UK. From our Jewish schools, to shuls, to university campuses, to our communal events and our daily lives. As the years have passed, CST's work has evolved. The organisation has developed and professionalised into a registered charity, constantly adapting to the changing nature of the threats that the Jewish community faces. From the oldest hatred to terrorism in all of its deadly forms. The work doesn't only involve physical security, but behind-the-scenes research too. CST seldom publicises it, but anti-Semites are identified, exposed, and often arrested and convicted. This includes on terrorism charges every year. Today, CST is a global leader of its type, with over 2,000 volunteers and staff working closely with the government and police. And while we might look a little different to those hardened fighters of years gone by, to this very day, we're guided by the exact same principles that motivated those who came before us. To stand up against anti-Semitism and terrorism, protect our Jewish community, and safeguard Jewish life.
So that was the CST's campaign video, and it's interesting because the way that we collect money for charities these days, especially in what our next video will call COVID times, has changed. The 36-hour matching campaign is something that you see pretty much every weekend, and as it's Purim, and as I think you all need cheering up generally, here's Ashley Blaker with a reminder about 36-hour campaigns.
There you go.
Hello, Ashley Blaker here with a very important message for the entire Jewish community. It's been a dark period, an unprecedented time, but next month the unthinkable might happen, and we may experience a tragedy the like of which we haven't known in this community for quite some time. Incredibly, there is a weekend coming when there isn't a single charity matching campaign. Just imagine that, a whole 36 hours with no videos asking you to donate, no updates, no announcements of a bonus round. In these COVID times, how will you even know who your friends are if they aren't bombarding you on WhatsApp asking for money? How will you know who to be broigus with because they didn't give as much to your fundraising page as you gave to theirs? And how will you even know it's the weekend without the relentless requests for donations? But my friends, with your help, we can ensure this disaster is averted. For the next 36 hours, all matching campaigns that you organise will be matched by a second matching campaign. That's right, matching the matching campaigns means that the matching campaigns are matched, so not only are all your match donations matched, but the matching campaign is matched by matched campaigns whose donations will then all be matched.
I'm extremely proud to support this incredibly important campaign.
Please start a matching campaign today. The community needs more matching campaigns. Thanks.
Start a matching campaign today so we can match it tomorrow.
Please match, but only in a COVID-safe way.
The JC is proud to be the media partner for this campaign.
No. The Jewish News is media partner for this campaign.
No, you're both wrong. Hamodia is the media partner for this campaign.
Matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match.
And for any calories you eat this weekend, I will match them by eating double.
And exciting news, we've just matched and there are now 2 of us. So let's make sure every weekend is a matching weekend. Let's get matching. Bye!
So it's a little bit light-hearted, but
I think so. But look, the CST, as I'm looking at it, £2,854,850.
They've done phenomenally well, and it really is one of those causes which we all benefit from, regardless of which corner of Judaism you come from. You have got the protection of the CST, and it's one of those organizations that really does need your support now more than ever. And they've done extremely well this weekend, but everybody should keep going. So the link to support that campaign is rolling across the bottom. Rabbi, that we just showed the Ashley Blaker clip there, and there were 2 moments where the humor is a little bit, I don't know, it crosses it very close to a line. One, when he does his Rabbi Elchanan Blaker impersonation, and the other is obviously when he talks about the Hamodia newspaper. And I guess this is really what we want to discuss tonight as well, in terms of labels and how we view these things. Where we sometimes we don't notice when we use labels how that tends to color an entire image that people get about a set of people. And it was only when Robert Festenstein said that he was watching one of the Sunday Night Lives, and I'd used the term Haredi, and I said during that Sunday Night Live that I hate using the word Haredi, because I feel that it just isn't an appropriate term for a very diverse group of people. Maybe we should start from, what does the word mean to you? And if you identify as a Haredi Jew, how does that make you feel when somebody uses that word?
Okay, so I think, when I guess we'll come back to that other conversation that we had about tainting an entire community, especially with Haredim, having looked at the newspaper headlines 2 weeks ago about all ultra-Orthodox people being in forced marriages. So we'll come back to that one afterwards. But the idea of Haredi, actually, I'm not sure when the term was coined. I think it was coined early on in the state of Israel. And it actually has its roots in the Navi. So in the prophet, in the Haftarah that we read, Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, so that's it says, Shimu v'Hashem, listen to the word of Hashem, HaCharedim el Davaro, those Chare, the word Charada is a Hebrew word also, and it means trembles, right? So Charedim el Davaro in the as it's translated is those that tremble for his words. And it really means is these are the people that are most religious, I guess is the best way of phrasing it. They're the people for whom the word of Hashem is paramount, all the way at the top of the totem pole, without any equal whatsoever. Okay? So that would be, Haredi. The problem is, as I remember when I was in Israel, and I'm sure you lived in Israel for quite a long time also, so you know exactly what I mean. If you say to somebody, oh, they're all Sephardi Jews, especially if you speak to Sephardi taxi drivers,
Yes.
they get very upset about it. What do you mean? I'm an Iraqi Jew. He's a Tunisian Jew. This is a Spanish Sephardi. And these are, they all have the different types of Sephardim. Now, we as Ashkenazim don't know the difference, so we just lump them together and we call them all Sephardim. But to call all Sephardim Sephardim is like calling all Ashkenazim Ashkenazim. Wait a minute. You have traditional Jews. You have Hasidic Jews. You have Lithuanian Jews. You have German Yakis. You have Mizrahi Jews. They're all part of the different stripes and different colors that come as Jews come. And so to just say all Ashkenazi Jews is one, it's just not understanding the demographic. And similarly, to say all Haredi Jews are one also misunderstands the demographic, as you mentioned before. So I think maybe we split that demographic further down, we whittle it down further, and then we try to see if we can get a clearer picture of what is or what isn't. But in the general idea, Haredim are people who are very sort of gung-ho, they're very, very into Judaism in a very sort of strong way.
It's interesting because lahavdil, there is very similar words for people in non-Jewish religion. So in Christianity, the Quakers, to quake means to shake, which is the same as Haredi.
So interesting.
And so they are seen as being extremely orthodox and pious. And to me, the word Haredi that we see so often in headlines nowadays and in the newspapers, and it's used by members of the wider Gentile public as well, when they're trying to address a certain a group of individuals, and it's seen as being almost like the elixir that nobody can quite reach. How do we engage the Haredim? Can we get to the Haredim? It's a big point. The Fed make a point about, we work together with the Haredim. We're one of these organizations that manages to reach across the abyss to the other side of our community. And when we talk to the Crown Prosecution Service, they talk about the Haredim as well. It's become one of these phrases that you hear quite a lot, particularly perhaps maybe in the last 5 years, but certainly it wasn't common to read about Haredim. It's almost something that has descended upon us more recently. When I was growing up, if you'll forgive me if this is in any way offensive to anybody watching, but if we wanted to refer to a Haredi Jew, we would probably end up calling them a frummer or somebody that is frum. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to translate that into English, you would say they're ultra-Orthodox. Mm-hmm. The issue with these words is that to use them nowadays makes you feel uncomfortable. And to say ultra-Orthodox, it also tends to, I know a lot of Haredim, if you like, don't like that term ultra-Orthodox because it implies in its name and its terminology an almost extremist view of life and religion that is rigid and that you know not very accepting of other people. And I think that when we now look at the modern use of Haredi and the way that we read that in the press, unfortunately, it has come to be a catch-all term for a very diverse group of individuals, but it's always used in the negative, almost pejorative term, and it upsets me.
Right. No, I get you. So what I would say about the thing that you say about ultra-Orthodox, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So let's look at it, for example, historically. You have something that's called the conservative movement. Have you heard of the conservative movement in America?
Indeed.
So
yeah.
What's interesting is you had the movement that came after you had Orthodoxy only, and after you had Orthodoxy, at one point or another in the 1800s, there came a new movement started by Moses Mendelssohn and his students that became the Reform movement that tried to reform Judaism. And they went very, very far with their reforms. And then you had people that wanted to find a middle ground. So the conservative, they became what's known as Masorati. Masorati is like Masorah. They keep to our tradition. So they became conservative, right? So there's sort of, I'm not reforming Judaism. I'm conservative. I'm keeping things the way they were, which they weren't. But they were looking at the people that were more orthodox than them and say they're orthodox or they are ultra-orthodox. And they are keeping more than they have to. And I think sometimes this is where it comes into the whole discussion of orthodox, ultra-orthodox, etc., etc. And people say they're keeping the halacha more than they need to. And sometimes, or often, you'll find that it works the other way around, that people will point in the other direction and say they are not keeping the halacha as much as they need to. And I think many people that would say they take the term ultra-orthodox and they're very offended by it would say, I'm not ultra-orthodox. I'm keeping the law as it's meant to be kept, and you're not doing your bit, right? And many times I've had this. I remember I used to teach in Whitefield, and I had an individual who sat with me, and he said to me, this whole 3 weeks, 9 days business, it's pretty new. I mean, it's very recent. I said to him, yeah, it is recent. I mean, halachically speaking, it's only 500 years old, which is quite recent. So he goes, no, like when I grew up, there was no such thing. And I don't remember if I said, if I didn't say, but I basically want to say with him, with all due respect, I don't think you had like a very extensive Torah education to draw upon to say that I have never seen this, I've never heard this before. Many things that I tell people about, I don't know, the halachas of Shabbos, the halachas of davening, so I say, well, I've never heard of that before. Yeah, that's not my fault. I'll show you chapter and verse. I'll show you where it is. I didn't make this up. This is Shulchan Aruch. This is what we all keep. So you say, no, that's ultra-Orthodox. It's not ultra-Orthodox. It's standard thing. You just don't know what the standard is. So to use standard starts sounding very, very extreme. And that's why I think the people get upset when they're called ultra-Orthodox, because they will come back and say, I'm not ultra-Orthodox. You make me sound like I'm this fanatic, that there's a reading of the law that is normal, and that's you. And then there's the me's and everybody else on the side of the room who say, that's not good enough for us. We want to be machmer and machmer and machmer. And everything that's really allowed, we want to pull and suck all the fun out of Judaism and make everything forbidden. And that's what makes us ultra-Orthodox. And these people take offense to it and say, we're not ultra-Orthodox. We're just Orthodox. And you might not be Orthodox enough.
It's very interesting because when you look at sort of reform, conservative, progressive, modern Orthodox, if you like, Michael's asking a question here. What about the term Chadal, which is Haredi Dati Leumi? That's something we don't necessarily see so much of in
no, we don't see it over here so much at all.
Maybe explain that for our viewers that are not familiar with that.
Okay, so I think before we explain Haredi Dati Leumi, I think we need to explain another label, which is Dati Leumi, and then we'll come on to explain the label of Haredi Dati Leumi. And that's the following. Dati Leumi, Dati means religious, Leumi, Leum is a nation. So Dati Leumi are very much, they are the Mizrahi movement, would see themselves as Dati Leumi. And within the Mizrahi movement, you'll find that they're even in the religious spectrum, you'll find there's a lot more leeway as far as things go. So you'll find Dati Leumi people will go to the theater, when you'll find Haredi people will not go to the theater, especially if it's a theater production that has women in it, so the men wouldn't go watch that. The women, my wife has been to watch theater productions put on by women, but it's by women, for women, not a theater production. They wouldn't go watch Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat because that they would see that as contradicting halacha. Whereas many Dati Leumi people, not all of them again, but many Dati Leumi people wouldn't see that as a problem, and they see culture as a very important thing. The other issue, so there are three real main differences between Dati Leumi, I would say, and Haredi, and that is, one is on culture, number two is on education, whereas you'll find in the Dati Leumi sector, secular education takes a very, very important role. Whereas in the Haredi sector, depending on how black you want to go, either it has no role whatsoever, or it has a functional role of being able to make a living with it. So if you become a computer programmer, I need to learn computer programming in order to be able to do that. I need to learn about the laws of accounting or the rules of accountancy to be able to become an accountant. But I wouldn't sit down just out of nowhere and read a book about history, the history of wherever it might be, because to me that's irrelevant. So that's point 2. And number 3 is this little me bit. Whereas within the Haredi world, they won't see the difference between the Dati Leumi world and the Haredi world is where the Dati Leumi world sees the state of Israel, the creation of the state of Israel, as the beginning of a process that's known as Reshit Tzmichat Geulateinu. And you'll see that we don't have that in the prayer for the state of Israel written by the chief rabbi's office. You don't have that. But in the prayer that they say in Israel, they actually use the words Reshit Tzmichat Geulateinu. And the translation Reshit means the beginning of Tzmichat, the sprouting Geulateinu of our redemption. So the Dati Leumi sector will say the fact that we have now returned back to our land is the beginning of the process of the Messiah, and is a process that needs to be embraced. It is a process that needs to be totally followed. So it means, Hatikva is very, very important. The army service is a big mitzvah, etc., etc. Whereas on the Haredi side, they would say it could be that, it could not be that. We don't know for certain. I'm not talking about the extreme Neturei Karta. The extreme Neturei Karta they say, no, we should have never taken over the land of Israel. Most of the Haredi people do not agree with that, and they'll say, no, the land of Israel belongs to us, but they don't see it as a religious imperative, rather as just a state that we have at the moment. That's Dati Leumi versus Haredi. Now, what often happens is within Dati Leumi, you'll find that people in general are, I wouldn't say less observant, but you got to be careful with that. But you'd say definitely less strict on certain chumras and on certain things. You'll find in general that if you were to compare even the frummer of the shuls, so if I were to take a shul like Steen Court, which is a Shomer Shabbos shul, no question about it, right? I would say a great percentage of the, if not all of the members in a shul like Steen Court, or a shul like Netzach or Shomer Shabbos, but I would, prop it up against the Shtibel or against Beis Mordechai or against Machzik Adas, you'd still say that the people in Steen Court, whilst fully religious, still have a much more modern view, a much more secular view about things. Chardalim tried to take the middle ground. So they are very heavily Dati Leumi, but they're very heavily frum. And you'll find them usually in Israel, you'll find they have very big kippot srugot. You won't find the little kippot srugot on them. You find like the massive, big white kippot srugot. Many of them have twirly payas. It's like an interesting thing to see. So you see these guys with techeles hanging out and the twirly payas in sandals without socks. And you speak to them in Torah, and these guys know Torah good and well. You speak to them and they're fully educated, but they're also very, very knowledgeable in Torah, and they're very, very ardent believers in Zionism. So that's where the Haredi Dati Leumi comes in. So it's a little bit noshing from either side, so to speak.
Interesting. So we've got another question here. Lisa Jacobs, good evening, Lisa.
Hi, Lisa.
Does more stringent always have to mean more from or observant? I've always struggled to understand this in this community. I don't know if Lisa means the Manchester community in particular or
Manchester
English.
often has been given that rap. Yeah, so it definitely has been given that rap that's what it is. So what I would say is more stringent is not necessarily always frummer, okay? Certain times it's wrong to take upon stringencies, and not every stringency that people take upon themselves is correct. However, I think many people that would see themselves as Haredi would say what they are doing is not stringent. You, on the other side, are just not clued in on what the law is really meant to be. So for example, I'll give you an example, right? Going back to what we said before, with a theater or with, Haredim will say, I had a conversation with somebody recently who said to me, why is it that frum people don't have internet at home? Yeah? So I'll say two things. Number one, it's a choice, okay? And everybody should be given the choice to have that. We don't have internet at home. I have it here in my office. And whenever I need to use the computer, I can come to my office. I have full access to the internet. There's no issue. We've never had a problem with it. The only time this became problematic was for 2 or 3 months during lockdown. If you remember that, right? Between March and May,
I remember very well. Yeah.
I was having an issue sort of logging into things. Somehow the one of the masts or one of the posts came down in Prestwich, and the mobile data was very, very bad, so I wasn't able to manage with that. But in general, there's a decision that people have made. I won't have the internet at home. That's a decision that people have made. But then you say, okay, but why don't you have a TV at home? Or why don't you let your kids watch Netflix, etc.? So people will say, oh, come on, it's just a bit of fun. Whereas the other side will say, within Netflix, you'll find lots of things that are not worthy or that are not right for a Jewish person to be watching. They might include lewd subjects. They might have nudity in them. They might have, things in them that are, forget about the heretical stuff. I'm not even talking about that. But there's a lot of things in there that just, as a full person, you don't want in your home.
It's the Wild West.
People that have it, and they would say, it's not that I'm being machmir not to have television. I would look at you and say, it's wrong for you to have a television at home. It's not within the spirit of halacha to have a television at home. This is not a stringency. This is something that should be black and white. And so that's where these arguments start coming up. Whereas there are certain things, let's see what it is. Keeping kosher. Okay?
For instance, keeping kosher, people keeping just the kosher compared to only supervised products, that's often deemed as a difference in frumkeit. I'd often answer, but the mitzvah of keeping kosher is being kept regardless.
Right.
I guess the point that I would make on all of this is that we are all extremely possessive of our own Judaism and our own standards. And we all believe, whether you are whichever color of Judaism you are, whether you are ultra-Orthodox, you're middle-of-the-road Orthodox, whether you're progressive, reform, whatever it is, if you were to speak to any Jewish person, and I'm now addressing all of them as one whole, they all feel that their version of Judaism is authentic. Occasionally, very occasionally, you meet perhaps what would have been classed, and again, this is pejorative as well, I don't like it, but would have been classed a 3-time-a-year Jew who will say, you know what, hands up, I am not keeping the authentic version of Judaism that my grandparents would have done. But I think on the whole, we all keep what we keep, and we actually consider that to be authentic. So when you meet an ultra-Orthodox person and they say, I'm not ultra-Orthodox, I just keep the letter of the law, this is what I do, it can be extremely different and very hard to explain how you view your version of my version of middle-of-the-road Orthodoxy, which embraces everybody's, tries to be very forgiving to everybody on either side of that middle. It's hard to explain that to them, and why I consider my version of Judaism to be authentic as well.
Okay, so again, that's part of the discussion that comes on what is or what isn't authentic Judaism. So I've had many people, I'll have to read that afterwards, I can't read and talk at the same time, I'm not a woman. You'll have to interview a woman, Yeah. So, I've had many people that we have this, where you have this discussion where people say to me, is this what I'm not the most Orthodox person, but my Judaism is very important to me. People will say that to me, right?
Yeah.
Now, they are not saying, I find in general that people in our community are very much like that. They are not saying that they are keeping authentic Judaism. They're keeping middle-of-the-road Judaism. I don't think people say, they say, I'm not as frum as the people over there, and they know they're not as frum as the people over there, and they know that a lot of people in our shul are really not keeping a lot of things that they're supposed to be keeping. But they know that. They're not saying, you know what, I have my brand of Judaism that doesn't include Shabbos, right? Because there's no brand of Judaism that doesn't include Shabbos, where you can go to Old Trafford, or I can go to shul in the morning and go to Old Trafford or to the Etihad. So I've said both of them. So whichever one of the two you want to go.
Yeah, it's really not worth breaking Shabbos to go to Old Trafford these days. I think that is the halachic verdict.
I stay very, very, I'm bipartisan on this one. I've always stayed out of it. Okay.
Very, very clever.
No, I do. I have two boys at home, and one supports Man United and one supports Man City, and I'm very much, I don't really care. either way.
But that would be termed, what you're referring to in terms of people that are able to balance going to let's say going to shul in the morning and going to the football in the afternoon was done for years. I mean, if you were to look at my grandfather's generation, the way that they ended up when they were older and when they came to the end of their life was probably a lot more frum in terms of the ways that we would view it than they were when they were first starting out their lives and professional lives. There were an awful lot of people back in the 50s or 60s that wouldn't have thought twice or wouldn't have even thought that it was particularly wrong to turn up at shul in the morning and then disappear to whatever it may be that they have to do during the rest of the day of Shabbos, because traditional Judaism was very, very different to the way that we see it today. And I think that we tend to see everything. Judaism has shifted to the right, I think, in terms of where the mainstream is today. It's interesting. I'm going to just bring up one of the comments here because Russell uses a bit of terminology here, which we'll all be familiar with. Russell says, good evening, Russell. He says, every middle-of-the-road Jew thinks that their brand of Judaism pitches the perfect balance. On one hand, he's Meshuggah Frum, which is the phrase that we're all familiar with, and this is a phrase that is very often uttered by parents whose children have become much frummer than they were. And on the other hand, he knows from nothing, and it's classic Jewish one-upmanship. He goes on to compare it to a comedy sketch. If you look at what Rodney's saying, Rodney is framing the debate in terms of our title. The debate is, are we one of us or one of them? I am one of us, and I'm quite prepared to accept them for what they are providing. Number one, they are prepared to accept me for what I am. And number two, they do not act in a way which is Chilul Hashem and bring all of the Jewish community into disrepute. Comment, please. And I guess, before I let you comment, Rabbi, what Rodney is referring to, we've seen these comments week after week since we first started. Our first debate that we ever had was all about Garden Minyanim. And from as early on as I can remember, some of the comments, very thinly veiled in a politeness that means to excuse their phraseology, but they talk about Haredi or very frum Jews not adhering to the rules. And I guess this is where Rodney brings it in his comment as well. So it's worth addressing.
Right. Okay. So there are two things that I would say over here. Number one, I think that as in my experience with frum Jews and or Haredi Jews, and in my experience with traditional Jews, I have found to be frum Jews much more accepting of the traditional Jew than the traditional Jew being accepting of the frum Jew. I've heard a lot less negative things about traditional Jews from my frum friends than I've heard from traditional Jews about the frum people. I would also say that most of the organizations, most of the chesed organizations in town, which are run by frum Jews, which we spoke about 2 weeks ago, they all said, look, we provide services for everybody, whether it's Misaskim, whether it's Ezra Care, whether it is, and a lot of these things, they have hundreds of volunteers and they're all willing to go out and they're all willing to do whatever it takes for whoever it is within the community. So what I would say is that I think that, it depends what you consider acceptance. I think when you say accept me for what I am, that's where things get very complicated. You can either say accept me for what I am means accept me as a person, or do you mean to say accept me and my brand of Judaism? Okay? And there are two different things that are going on over here. And what I would say is when you speak to frum people, they are very, very accepting of non-frum people in general. They would say, look, this person keeps Shabbos, this person doesn't keep Shabbos. That's how they see it. What they are not accepting of, and they won't make any excuses or any apologies for it, and neither will I, is different brands of Judaism that will say this is also an authentic strand of Judaism, to which they say we don't believe this is authentic. To go to shul in the morning and to go to the football in the afternoon, to an a Haredi Jew, or hopefully even to any Jew who is properly religious, looks at that and says, this is not an authentic brand of Judaism. And whilst you want to call it middle of the road, and maybe you see yourself as middle of the road, as far as Judaism is concerned, this is not middle of the road. This is, you've taken a step out of traditional Judaism. It's middle of the road between as Russell said before, the guy who is Meshuggah from and the guy who knows from nothing. Right? That's what Russell said before. But we're saying it's not a question of Meshuggah from or not. If you go to Old Trafford or to the Etihad on Shabbos, it's nothing to do. The guy who doesn't go to the Etihad or doesn't go to Old Trafford on Shabbos is not Meshuggah from. He's just keeping the law. And your brand of the law is not really law. You know, it's coming back actually to what Rodney was saying before in number 2, is he's upset about the way people act and bringing a chilul Hashem on people, is, you know, you say, well, they're keeping the law in their way. Well, to which a lot of people say, there's no such thing as keeping the law in my way, right? There's no such thing in law. It says, well, we believe we don't have to wear masks. So we believe we can go into shops and we can all mingle together and it's not a problem. To which the answer would be, and I'm sure Rodney would be the first one to say that, you have no right to say that. Because the law is very clear about what it says, and you cannot make up laws just because you want to. To which the Frum community say, well, I'll throw that straight back at you just with Judaism.
Yeah.
And so therefore,
so Rodney wants us to be machmir on the rules relating to COVID, and the Frum community will want Rodney to be machmir on what they consider to be the rules of Judaism.
I guess so. You know, and so the question will become, and neither of the two will accept each other for what they believe they're doing wrong, but I think both of them need to accept each other and to say, you know what, I don't believe what you're doing is correct. However, as a Jew, I can still accept you as, you know, as my brother. I would also say, which is very important, this is the other thing, is that, you know, in the same way, when a irreligious, right? Okay, Rodney, I'm coming to that. Before we get to Dina Malchus Dina, because this is something I've heard so many times, so I wanted to deal with that. I'll quote you something else. Shamus, Kashrus. I've heard Dina Malchus Dina. It's coming out of my ears already. The Frum people will look at people who don't keep Shabbos, who don't keep kosher, and scream Shabbos and kosher, and you'll get an answer back, middle of the road. So to which they'll say, keep social distancing. So I'll say, I'm middle of the road at social distancing. You don't accept middle of the road in social distancing. You shouldn't accept middle of the road in Shabbos either. I remember hearing a story of a famous rabbi who was walking down the street when one of the sirens went in Israel. You know, there's a siren that goes off, whether it's on Yom Ha'atzmaut or Yom HaShoah or whichever one it is.
It's an air raid siren, yeah.
He kept walking, and the fellow got very angry, and he said, hey, you have to stop. You have to stop. It's 11 o'clock. There's a siren. So the rabbi turned around, smiled at the fellow, and said, Ani lo dati. That's it. As far as this point, I'm lo dati. I'm not religious, right? So we become very religious, but we become very, very selective about where we want to be religious and when we don't want to be religious. And if the only thing we are selective about is about Dina Malchut Dina, without yelling at people for not keeping Shabbos and there's Chilul Hashem, when I see a car drives by that says Goldberg on it, driving on Shabbos, that's just as much a Chilul Hashem as somebody who goes into shul without wearing a mask. They're both a Chilul Hashem. When I see a Jewish person walking into tray for a restaurant in town, that's a Chilul Hashem as much as it is for people to make a wedding when they're not allowed to make a wedding. And so that we have to realize there are two sides to this coin, and that people are pointing in one direction, and each side is pointing at the other side in their direction without the other side listening to the other side. And that's
I must clarify, the rabbi wasn't pointing out one particular Goldberg. It could be a Goldstein, a Greenstein, a Greenberg. It could be anybody.
Could be anybody. But I know, and I see when I walk down Berry New Roads, I see cars from our community that have, you know, special number plates driving into town or driving back from town, and they're announcing to the world, "Here I am driving on Shabbos." It's you know, that's just as much a Chilul Hashem.
Well, let's have a look at some more comments, because we're going to get drawn into this discussion. It's incredibly emotive. I'm going to be extremely kind to Clive Moss Barkley and read his comments in reverse order, because when you take it in the context of what he's saying, it seems a lot more kind. Rashi was a wine merchant and Rambam was a physician. It didn't harm them. And what he means by that is that ignorance of worldly matters and lack of general knowledge, as far as the wider world's concerned, appears to be a common feature of ultra-Orthodox. And why? When I read those kind of comments, and had Clive said that without backing it up with this, I'll be honest with you, I would have been absolutely incensed, because I feel that is the those kind of comments are very unhelpful as regards labeling one particular group of individuals. And also when we talk about the fact that, certain people don't keep social distancing, there are many from people that keep a very high level of social distancing. You don't hear about them. And to class them all as one group in a negative manner. But you know what? This is actually what Clive says here has some absolute basis.
There's validity to what Clive is saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this lack of general knowledge about the wider world frustrates other Jews in terms of why don't they understand the way that the world sees them? Let me ask you a question. Do they care? Do they care what Clive... Do Haredi Jews care what I think about them or what Clive thinks about them? Honest.
Some would and some won't. It's hard for me to give an overarching, an overarching answer to that question. In general, probably depend on what it is that you think about them. If you think they're ignorant in worldly matters, they might say, "I'm proud of being ignorant in worldly matters," and they don't really care. And you'll always find, as Russell mentions, Rabbi Twersky, you will find the exceptions. But I would say, in general, the rule as is, if the further right you go within the Haredi camp, and you can go further right, you will find that people take secular education less seriously. And whether it is, it's for one of two reasons, I think. The first reason I would say is because people feel that they want to make their life within the Torah confines. So that's their education. The same way you go to university to study a subject to then work in it, they will spend their life in yeshiva studying that extensively so that they can then go back and give as much as they can and be as intelligent as they can with that. And whatever else they have within the secular education is just functional. It's not necessary. And so therefore they say, do I know basic arithmetic? Yes. Is my spelling great? No, but I write on a computer and it spell checks for me. Is are my English compositions great? No, but I'm not really planning on becoming a writer, so it's really irrelevant to me. So they'll see a lot of these things as not that relevant to them, so they won't spend the time on it. That's number one. Number two, which is what I would say, is that people will also feel, even if I don't end up becoming a Torah scholar and I end up working, there are plenty of people. I would, appoint a community in Stamford Hill, and I don't know if how much of them have come to you, to you, David, and try to buy real estate by you or to buy property with you. But you go to Stamford Hill and you find some of the least educated people have done extremely well. They are very savvy. They are very, very business-minded, and they've come up with some great ideas and some great businesses. And they might not be able to write a business plan for you that would, that would come into any consultancy firm, but it's irrelevant because they're making millions of pounds regardless. And so therefore, they would see it A, as a waste of their time, and B, as something that's unnecessary for them to earn a living, because if they do need to earn a living, they'll find a way to earn a living without having to go to university, as so many other people do in this country. There has become almost a trend, I think, in the more middle of the road, you must go to university. If you had a boy that decided he did, or a girl who decided they didn't want to go to university, coming out of King David looks at that as a failure. And I remember Jeff Radovan getting very upset about it. Do you remember Jeff speaking? I don't know if Jeff spoke to you about it, but he said that the first time, maybe a year or two ago, was the first time where King David actually allowed in the careers evening to have a stall about apprenticeships. But until then, there was never a stall about apprenticeships because which parent wants a kid to go to apprenticeship? You have to go to university, my kid. Otherwise, you'll be considered forever, some kind of Amaret, some kind of boor. And therefore, the Haredi side says, it's not necessary. It's not something I need to do. It's only something that whatever I need to be able to survive with the basics, I'll do. Beyond that is extras. I don't need to do it. And again, as Clive said, does it hurt? It might not hurt to know a little bit more. It definitely wouldn't hurt to know a bit more. Why do they do it? This is probably the reason why they do it.
Okay, let's have a look at some of the other comments.
It's really getting getting heated up.
Lisa again. I always say Judaism is like a game of football. You either follow the game or you don't. If you pick up the ball with your hands, you're breaking the rules of the game. And yes, there are varying levels, but the game remains the same. Fair comment.
That's very, very good. I think that's a very good parable. I like that, Lisa.
David Cohen has chucked in a grenade, which, it looks like a simple question, but it's hard to answer. Okay, please explain. What is a Jew?
Okay, so to which I would say, David, I think that you've not been specific enough with the question. So please come back and put in another further comment within the comments. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'm not sure what your question is. What makes a Jew? I'm just not sure what the question is.
I think David probably is looking at it in the terms of when we examined authentic Judaism and what that means. He might be talking about that, but let's David.
Okay, so let's go down that let's go down that route if you want to. What is a Jew? So I remember there's actually a famous rabbi by the name of Rabbi Gifter, who was a Rosh Yeshiva in America, who also got very upset. He says, I don't like the terms modern Orthodox, Haredi, etc., etc. What he terms is Torah true Jews and non-Torah true Jews. That's, and again, I think that's a little bit too broad because everybody would say that their brand of Judaism is Torah true. But let's call it that. Torah, a Jew, or what is Judaism? Judaism is not just a culture. Judaism is not just a religion. It's really a way of life. It's a way of life. If you read about it from, going through the Chumash, etc., you'll find that the Jewish people were taken out of Egypt, and God says, do you want to become my people, and will you keep the law that I have given you? And the answer that we gave was Na'aseh v'nishma. Yes, we want to become your nation, and we want to keep your laws. And therefore, becoming a Jew involves just that. I'll give you the extreme example of this, but the important example within it. If you have somebody that wants to become Jewish, what does that mean? When people come to the Beth Din, and many of you might have heard about potential converts or people who converted, and they were given a really, really hard time. The Beth Din is sometimes very nasty almost to them in the way they, I know somebody that went to the Beth Din, they were asked to take out the benching, they started benching, they said, not fluent enough, come back in 6 months.
Yeah, it doesn't feel friendly. Yeah. It doesn't feel friendly and welcoming.
It doesn't feel friendly at all. The answer to the question, well, why do they do that? The answer is because the Beth Din says, look, we're not here to be friendly. If you want to join the club, there are 3 things you need to join the club. And this is part of why Orthodoxy doesn't accept Reform or conservative conversions. To become Jewish, you need to do 3 things. A, you need to have a bris milah if you're a man. A woman obviously doesn't need one. B, you need to go to the mikveh. But C, most importantly, you need to accept upon yourself to become a practicing Jew. And therefore we say, we don't need to convert people to become non-practicing Jew. If you want to become a non-practicing Jew, just stay a non-Jew and continue being non-practicing. What exactly do you want to become Jewish for? What's the point of becoming Jewish? You want cholent? Go to David's Deli. You want gefilte fish? You can go to Chef and buy it there. You can have all the perks without having to have any of the obligations. What are you becoming Jewish for? And what we say therefore is, in order to become Jewish, you are accepting upon yourself a certain way of life. If you want that way of life, great. Prove that you want it. Prove that you learn enough of it. And if, for example, if you have a Jewish boyfriend or Jewish girlfriend and then you want to convert, the Beth Din says, not only do I want the convert to become religious, I need the boyfriend or the girlfriend to become religious as well. Because if you're going to marry you can't have a religious convert marrying an irreligious Jewish boy or irreligious Jewish girl, because what's going to happen is the whole Judaism is going to fall apart again. You want to become Jewish. That means you're joining in to become an observant Jew. That's how we define it. So are there Jews that don't keep all the laws? Yes, there are Jews who don't keep all the laws. Are they any less Jewish than somebody who does keep the law? No. All Jews are equal, right? Whether you keep the law, whether you don't keep the law, there is no difference. So that if you had two people drowning and one was religious and one was not religious, nowhere does it say that you're allowed to save the religious one and let the irreligious one drown. That's not brought in halacha, because we don't make those decisions. They're both Jewish, they both have the same. So if you can save both, great. If you can save only one, it's a terrible dilemma to be in. But the Gemara doesn't say, well, he keeps Shabbos, he doesn't, so take the Shabbos observant one. That's not the answer within the Gemara. So everybody's as Jewish as another, but you want to ask, what makes us Jews? What makes us Jews is the fact that we observe Judaism, not that we were born through a long line of people that kept Judaism and then decided to ignore it.
Well, there are different opinions on that in terms of how people view cultural Judaism.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, we're one of these people where culture and our religious practices are very much intertwined. It's hard to pick out the cultural bits that don't have some sort of religious practice with it. So if you're, you know, most Jews, whichever brand of Judaism that they're in, will have a Seder night, and that will have the same ritualistic elements with, you know, from all the way from conservative all the way up to ultra orthodox. It's a very interesting view. I'm going to pick out one of the comments because I love him and he's my dad. But here, Jonathan Mintz, whether his name is Haman, Hitler, or Hamas, our enemies are not as fussy as we are. In their eyes, we are all the same. Sinas Chinam is our eternal enemy. And that
I can't say it any better than that.
That simplifies the debate somewhat. Adam Patrick is due a Mazel Tov, Adam Patrick, on your new niece. And thank you, Adam, for supporting all the Sunday Night Lives. He always watches. Russell Cooper was sadly mourning Rabbi Twersky there. And then he
was mentioning somebody who was well educated at being a very good Jew.
Michael Gasworth is bringing a view, not his, I don't think, but from an anonymous view, who cannot join this discussion, but would like to add the following point. I think this discussion is very different for UK Jews as opposed to Israeli Jews. I think ultimately these discussions are very mistaken for two reasons. Number one, people confuse changing hashkafa, becoming Haredi after yeshiva, for example, versus just becoming more religious, i.e. keeping Shomer Negir, washing before bread and benching during the week, not just on Shabbos, etc. Most people I know confuse the latter with the former. I've not got the rest of that comment because I'm not on the Facebook page.
Also, I'm not on Facebook either. Maybe
I will log in and try and find it. But you can,
the second part of the comment.
You can. You can. I'm going to have a look at the second part of the comment. Maybe we'll have a look at what Russell says in the meantime. Rabbi, do you want to read that?
Yeah, sure. Judaism is not just wearing a frock coat, a black hat, and attending shul 3 times per day. It's just important to be honest and business, even with a non-Jew. 100%. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. And, you know, when people say, I know religious Jews that cheat in business, the answer is they're wrong, right? There's nothing correct. There's nothing Jewish about cheating in business. So you say, but they profess to be more religious than I am. They are more religious than you are in certain aspects. And if they're not honest in their business dealings, then they are less religious than you are in other aspects. And then you say, well, they look down upon me for my lack of, for my lack of observance, whatever it is. You're right. They shouldn't be looking down upon you if they're not as observant as they make out to be as well. But I think it's correct to say that both sides, I think we spoke about this in the sermon 3 weeks ago, that there are two sides to Judaism, the Ben Adam L'Chaver and the Ben Adam L'Kam side, and both sides are important, and you cannot exchange one for the other, or say this side is important and the other side's not so important, and I decide to just disregard the laws of one or the other where it suits me.
So let's have a look at the rest of that comment there. I've got it now.
You're going to pull it up.
So I'm going to read it out because I don't think I can transpose it onto the screen there. But basically, the writer was saying that they think ultimately these discussion is very mistaken for two reasons. Most people I know confuse the latter with the former, and it's not true. To live by your beliefs more is not changing hashkafa. It's becoming more religious without changing hashkafa. Number two, most people don't understand what halacha is or how it works. So their understanding of what constitutes frumkeit is very different once you learn proper halacha and how it works.
I agree with both of those points, I would say. So I'll go through them one at a time. And that is, I've heard of this. People started, they started becoming shomer negia. And then you say, oh, you're shomer negia, you're not touching girls anymore, you become charedi. And they'll say, well, look at Shulchan Aruch. And Shulchan Aruch is quite explicit about whom you're allowed to touch and whom you're not allowed to touch. That's not a charedi thing. That's just becoming more religious. It's just you've decided not to keep this. And because you don't know about the halachas of whom you are, whom you're not allowed to touch, therefore, you look at it and you say, I've become very frum. It's actually interesting. I've heard from a few people in our shul, more than one, that tell me that, they're okay if somebody, gives the wife a peck on the cheek or something, but somehow they feel some men just come too close.
Yeah.
It's okay the way he does it, but it's not okay the way he does it. He's just a little bit too close for comfort.
Yeah. So some contact can be creepy, as
it's just that little bit too creepy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
100%.
But it's interesting, and it's hard to know where do you differentiate. In Judaism, if you want to look at halachic Judaism, it says a peck on the cheek or coming too close and a really close hug. Neither of the two are okay, right? But that's just standard halacha. That's not being charedi. So you say, well, I allow people to give my wife a peck on the cheek, but I won't allow anybody to sort of embrace my wife and hold her really tight and close. That's your definition. But that's not being charedi.
I think being charedi has finally come full circle, because now in the mainstream as well, and certainly after COVID, we're going to see a whole alternative reality where person-to-person contact, you've got to give somebody their space. It's not okay to presume that you can go up to a woman and kiss her on the cheek, or a man. They're entitled to their own personal space, and if they indicate that's what they would like you to do consensually, that's what you could do. But certainly post-COVID, where we've been kept apart physically from one another, I think that we're not going to just go back to those norms. So maybe being charedi will actually come in quite handy at that point.
Well, no, it's the other way around. COVID comes in quite handy for charedim. I'm sorry to put it that way. I know it's a horrible way to say it. But, when you've been to a business meeting and somebody stretched out their hand to you and you say, I'm really sorry, I don't shake hands with women. And I've done that to the mayor of Manchester. It's been a very uncomfortable thing. Yeah. Thank God I was standing next to a priest. Can't remember. He's an African priest. I can't remember which brand it was. But and the fellow Doye Ogama, I still remember, Bishop Doye Ogama said to her, please don't feel insulted. Religious Jewish men don't shake hands with women, no matter who the woman is. Okay, so But if somebody were to stretch out their hand to me and I say, I'm really sorry, I'm not shaking hands, I'd be like, of course not. Suddenly it's become more accepted because it's become something that the rest of the world sees as a norm now as well. I do feel that, give it 3 to 5 years, we'll go back to the regular, and I don't think Haredim will have that to fall back upon anymore. And, those people,
maybe
but
not.
I hope so. I hope we'll go back to having person-to-person contact without everybody being nervous about the other.
So do you remember, I'm going to bring up Rodney's comment, but before we do, just to frame it in a context that some people would understand, you had Jeffrey Brody at the Basin, who was seen as being very much Jewish Manchester's, certainly Jewish Orthodoxy's, a spokesperson to the wider world. And you had other people like that. You had people like Shlomo Adler, you had people like Maya Halpern, these great forces for good within the community who work tirelessly to really translate what it means to be a frum Jew and what's important to us to the outside world. And they, I believe, treated everybody, Jew and non-Jew alike, with absolute respect. But Rodney is correct in what he says next. Sadly, too many Haredim treat the non-Jew without respect. There is some people who will look at people from the outside world, and because they don't embody the same qualities that they have, they don't treat them with respect, and they won't treat Rodney with respect either, because sadly, to some of them, Rodney is about as Jewish as the mayor, because they don't represent the same.
The same, but you know what I'm saying, like
you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
There is a lack of respect, and it sort of goes down. But we are here to sort of build bridges with the wider community, regardless of whatever religion. But I've got to say, there are some people that are still out there doing it. So we spoke to Miss Askim the other week, didn't we? And the work that they're doing in terms of building bridges with coroners' offices and translating our religious needs into language that they can understand and respect is superb. So there are still people doing it, but there are some people that don't have basic respect.
No, and I would agree with that. There are some people that don't have basic respect. I think also that there are certain demographics within the Haredi community where this is more prevalent, and in general, it comes from, I think that for many years there was if you've lived through whatever it was in Europe, being tormented again and again, and I think sort of like it really depends. So when you lived in Germany and you had very, very high class non-Jews, and then you have the Rav Hirschian Jews, you have the Torah and Der Herz Jews. Yeah. They worked together with their communities, and they saw the non-Jewish German as a very, well put together, highly educated, etc., etc. Sadly, we saw, 50, 70 years after that,
the other side of that.
With all the education, it's not, it still doesn't help with the anti-Semitism. But you take Eastern European Jews and their counterparts, if you grew up in the shtetl and the Cossacks came riding through the shtetl, burning down houses and getting drunk every night in the Krechner, they had a very, very different non-Jew that they grew up with. And so therefore, their historic way of looking at non-Jews, and in general, the entire movement's perception of non-Jews was very much Shikar is the guy.
I think that's a very fair point. A very fair point.
And so that, it depends where you come from is what you've grown up with. If you've grown up, when you grew up in the shtetl in Russia, it probably wasn't so wrong to say that Shikar is the guy, because a lot of the population around them were peasants, were not highly educated. There wasn't much to admire about them, and they just got drunk and beat up on the Jews. So they said, Yena Goy, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Whereas in other countries, you had a very, very different perception. I think in Spain also, you don't read about this derision about the very highly, during the golden age of Spain, and when you had these people like the Rambam and you have the Ramban, etc., you don't read that derision against the non-Jews because the non-Jew had a different quality to them. So I think it's very much a cultural thing. And whilst Rodney's right that there are too many people out there that don't treat them with respect, I think if you understand the culture that they come from and how they've grown up, it's part of how they've grown up and how they see the world. So it's a hard job, and then for all of us, it's a hard job. If we want to change around the way we see others, it's a really difficult job. It's a really, really hard one.
We're just going to read through the last comments because I'm mindful of your time, Rabbi. I don't know if you've got
something.
I'm
not, I'm enjoying this. This is a real fight.
Okay, he's on the clock. Okay, here we go. Lisa, there's also a big difference between spirituality and developing a relationship with Hashem. To those who just keep the mitzvahs and look religious on the outside, but with no deep emunah. Do you think it's possible to be very spiritual but not be mitzvah observant?
So that's a very, very good question, Lisa. And the answer to that question is it depends how you define spirituality. So can you feel a certain closeness to Hashem? Yes. But if you would define spirituality as, or if you define, doing the right thing, if you define it as, I want to be doing the right thing, I want to feel close to God, God says, okay, if you want to feel close to me, this is how I'd like you to interact with me. And so therefore, sometimes I give you the example, David, I don't know about you, but sometimes you have people that feel really, really good about you and real friendly to you, and you don't feel the same way about them. Has that ever happened?
It happens the other way around mostly, yeah. But no.
Yeah, okay. Some people are very, they think you're so charming and etc. That this guy is great, this Mintz fellow. And you look at the guy and you're like, this guy's such a nudge, he's such a pain, it's so difficult. And they're constantly trying to come close to you, and you keep on saying, you keep on thinking to yourself, Nudnik, will you just leave me alone, right? And so that within a relationship, especially when you have a relationship like one with God, it's very hard for us to decide what it is that creates that relationship. If I were to go home now and I were to decide that, in order for my wife and I to have a great relationship, she has to come stop watching football with me when she has no interest in football whatsoever, then what I'd be doing is I'd be taking my feelings, imposing them on her, and then saying, we have a great relationship because we watch football together. Yeah, that's how you feel. Ask her, we have a terrible relationship. He sits me in front of the TV for 2 hours on a Sunday, watching a whole bunch, 11 people on 2 different teams kicking a ball back and forth, which I have no caring for whatsoever. So therefore, the question of can you be spiritual without mitzvah observant is very important to keep in mind, that if you want to develop a relationship with God, if you believe that God has given you a blueprint of how to develop that relationship, you then need to follow that blueprint to have that relationship. Otherwise, you can think you're being spiritual, but without the mitzvah observance, it's like dragging your wife to the couch to make her watch the football rather than doing what your wife really wants to create that relationship with her.
Right, that's a very interesting perspective on that. Clive Moss-Barkley says, this discussion reflects an obsession that we as Jews have of always trying to find the differences between us rather than looking for the common denominator. Isn't this why we lost the temples and why we're still waiting for Mashiach 2,000 years later? Echoing that, Michael says, the truth is that all labels go out of the window when it comes to doing business together. Until it comes to receiving payment, then the labels get thrown back in again. And Rodney has backed what he said earlier by giving the other side of that coin. Baruch Hashem, there are today some fabulous Haredim in our community who have a wonderful relationship with the non-Jewish community, and I will sing their praises. So that's good to hear. So I guess, Rabbi, to sort of kind of sum all of this up,
I think we've only done part 1 of this discussion.
Well, we can gladly have part 2, but my take on this.
We didn't even discuss sort of like bridging the gaps. I think tonight was just trying to understand the other side.
So we've laid out where the differences are, and we need to now look at how we do bridge those gaps, because these labels, yes, they're useful so that I can refer to Rodney and say, Rodney, I'm talking about Haredim, and he will know instantly who I'm talking about. Now, unfortunately, when I use that word, it is a catch-all term for people who are going to be Hasidish, Litvish, all different kinds of Judaism. And within that diverse group of Haredim, there will be people that consider and will look down on other Haredim and think they're not quite as from as them, or they're not quite as authentic.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
We need to find a way to build those bridges. And I guess in part 2 of this discussion, which I'm very happy to have next week, because
I think we should do part 2 of this discussion next week, discussing how do we build those bridges.
Well, I guess we'll have a look at that next week, because I think those bridges do need to be built. And the reason we need to concentrate on building those bridges is because so much of what we've said here, when you use the term Chilul Hashem, we're talking about the way that we represent ourselves as a nation, as a people, to non-Jewish people in the outside world. And if we can't get together and seem on the same page, then what impression are we actually giving those people? Do they truly understand what we're all about? Are we that enlightened to the nations that we talked about in one of our previous discussions? So let's try.
I'll actually finish with one thing that was really nice today, and then we'll finish with that. But I think it's a great point. Thank you, Lisa, for tuning in. Please keep tuning in. I hope we will continue to give you quality things. next week a Haredi and a female Reform rabbi. I'm sorry, everyone. I take that very personally. I am a Haredi rabbi. Okay, but I'm just not with as long a beard. But it was interesting. Just today, I'm standing outside. I was about to go. My wife wanted to go to the park with me and with my kids. And this fellow walks past. He says, "So, did you have a nice Purim?" Non-Jewish fellow, obviously non-Jewish.
Yeah.
And I said, "Yeah, Phil, that's a great point. We did with the Bells of First Shabbat UK. That was a phenomenal event. We'll talk about that next week. Maybe we can bring in Phil next week to speak about
I would love to get Phil on the show. Because I missed him.
And not only that, maybe we could get one of the Belzers in as well from the maybe from the traveling Hasidim.
I think I know who to talk to.
Yeah, we can speak. We'll speak to Berish Dresner. We'll speak to Avram Schleimer.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm sure they would come on. Actually, it'd be very interesting to have that conversation, and we could broaden this conversation. I think it'd be great. But it was interesting. So this non-Jewish fellow stopped in front of me and he said, "So how was your Purim?" I said, "Well, quiet." And he said to me, "I love Purim." And he started telling me, proceeding telling me his name was Mike. He'd been in the British Army for 24 years. He was a veteran, 6 tours to Afghanistan. He'd been in Iraq. He'd been all sorts of places and really done tremendous service to this country. And then his wife, sadly, she's had a stroke. So he's now her carer. But he says he lives next door to another family a bit further down the road, from us. And he said they're the nicest people. They're just such nice people. And before Purim, we'll go out to Haber's and we buy things to make sure that it's kosher and we give it to them. And I love the party that goes on. And I really love, he says, and he was just so happy. And he says, "I must tell you that the Jewish people that I live next to are the nicest people around. I couldn't ask for better neighbors, and I couldn't ask for a nicer group of people to live amongst. And I'm so happy I live on the street, and I'm so happy that these are my neighbors." So, whilst we often berate each other that we're doing a bad job, but that one's doing a bad job, many times if you speak to the outside world, we're actually not doing as bad a job as we're giving ourselves credit for. And, people are looking at those that live next to them and say, "You know what? These Jewish people, they're good people. They're, upstanding people. They will go out of their way to help their neighbors if they can. They will take care of whatever needs taken care of." And, to have somebody like that pass by me unsolicited to start, we ended up talking for 15 minutes, and to tell me how he loves living amongst Jews, how he loves Purim, how he loves the costumes, how he loves the whole thing of it, and how the Jewish people are so wonderful. We need to hear more of that. And I think we need to tell each other more of that as well. Both sides of the divide need to say that to each other. And we need to try to build those bridges rather than burning them down and yelling, at each other. You don't know enough about this and you don't know enough about that. And you make a Chil Hashem this way and you make a Chil Hashem that way. It's not helpful. The question really is, what can we do together to make this work? And so I hope you'll come in for part 2.
Well, join us next week.
I hope Phil will join us. Phil, give us a comment. Come on, Phil. Will you join us for that?
Give us a sign of life, Phil, that you're going to come on next week. Phil, I'm very much hoping you'll join our discussion. Phil was a very central part of every Shabbat UK that we had, certainly at the beginning.
Amazing the amount of work that he put in. Just
he put his entire being into that. He was, by Motzei Shabbos, he was finished.
I remember that. He couldn't even stay for the concert. He had no craft left.
But Phil is a massive advocate of cross-communal collaboration.
Phil said okay.
There you go. Phil's agreed. Great, Phil. I've got to say, we pay very, very badly. But you've got some fans that are very happy that you're coming on board. So next week, join us at 8 o'clock on Sunday. We will be discussing, our topic will be building bridges. With Phil Morrison, actually.
Hopefully one of the traveling Hasidim.
I'm hoping so as well.
I'll speak to them. I'll try to get through to them. Do you want me to call them?
Yeah, why not? Let's see where we get to. Let's see where we get to.
Excellent.
Well, thank you very much for tuning in, everybody. And thank you as ever for your comments and your interaction. It's been a very interesting discussion. We'll see you next week for part 2.
Thank you.